Hello and welcome to Raj Sabha Television. I am Akhilesh Suman and you are watching Indian Standard Time. Indian Standard Time is a window to the world through which we try to understand global issues. And we have a very eminent guest today, Excellency the High Commissioner of Australia in India, Barry O'Farrell. Welcome, Excellency.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Excellency, on 9th of September this year, there was a new meeting. Actually, there was a first meeting between India, Australia and France. So it is really a new news to us also that how it happened and what you discussed in this meeting. It was first Foreign Secretary level meeting.
It was a Foreign Secretary's meeting and the ambassadors of each of the countries were also present. And it's a meeting that builds on a strong bilateral relations that each of the countries have with each other, but also a recognition of the importance of cooperation with these like-minded partners to ensure an open, inclusive and Indo-Pacific region. We all share that vision. In particular, we discussed the economic, the social and the geostrategic challenges in the region, particularly in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. And that included areas for practical cooperation at the trilateral and regional level, including through regional organisations such as ASEAN and EORA. The Foreign Secretaries also shared lessons learned in our respective domestic responses to the pandemic and also highlighted the importance of regional and global cooperation to recovery. And you won't be surprised, Akhilesh, that they also discussed ways to strengthen and reform multilateralism to ensure that the systems that we rely upon internationally continue to be fit for purpose, whether during this crisis or when the next one arises.
So what is the necessity of this new trilateral? Because India, Australia are always very close and they are also part of Quad. But when you make another trilateral with France, can you just tell me about the significance and necessity of it?
Well, clearly France, like India and Australia, have interests and influence within, for instance, the Indian Ocean. And that's another reason why at times like this, when you have pandemics, people with shared interests, with shared outlooks come together. And I think your External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, says it best, is that at times like this, nations cohere with groupings that have common interests. And as I say, the three of us have a common interest which extends across the Indian and Pacific Oceans, where France has interests, where Australia has influence, where India has influence. And we're determined to try and ensure that we work together to guarantee the freedom, to promote prosperity, and to ensure that there's security, both during this period but also in the post-COVID world.
So do we plan to make it more institutionalized, like taking it to the summit level among the three nations, or it is just one of the dialogues that has taken place?
Well, it's a dialogue that's taken place, but happily, Akhilesh, they've also decided to hold the dialogue on an annual basis at a Foreign Secretary's level. So in a sense, and I don't wish to raise expectations here, it's like other multi-country gatherings we have from time to time. They're at officer level. They do good work on specific issues, and ultimately they benefit not just each of the individual countries who are involved, but the region of the world in which we live, and to some extent through that work in relation to multilateralism, seek to benefit to the whole world.
So we have already Quad, and Quad has been very successful in correlating among the four. So what is next in Quad? There has always been talks that whether we can make Quad plus or not. So what is the thinking on Quad?
Well, the Quad is evolving as a good diplomatic forum for like-minded democracies to coordinate approaches on important issues such as maritime and cybersecurity and counter-terrorism. And it was good to see last year that there was a meeting involving the Quad ministers, which occurred in New York on the sidelines of the United Nations. But the Quad's also been very useful during this period to share individual perspectives and to try and improve the individual efforts of countries in tackling COVID-19. And that's not just been seen in the Quad, it's also been seen in countries in this region's involvement through ASEAN. I mentioned the fact that the trilateral with France involved the foreign secretaries. Well, there have been regular calls between the Australian and Indian foreign secretary throughout this crisis, and importantly, that's extended to other countries in the region like Japan, the United States, New Zealand, the Republic of Korea, the US, and Vietnam. And it's just a great example of how countries can come together, as I said before, at a time of crisis, talk about things that are relevant to them. And with the countries I've just mentioned, we're again discussing ways that we can strengthen supply chains and also improve regional and global health security.
So you talked about supply chain, and India is very ambitious about joining the global supply chain. When India and Australia are coming very close, so how India and Australia are going to work on this project, India joining the global supply chain?
Well, India is right to be ambitious about supply chains because the crisis has thrown up a great opportunity for India to boost its economic growth and its manufacturing base even further. But COVID-19, of course, has taught many nations and businesses, frankly, the risks in excessive dependence on any one particular country within the global value chain. And as I say, India is positioning itself as a central link with a more diversified post-COVID supply chains. And part of this is about strengthening its own industrial capacity through Prime Minister Modi's Atmanirbhar Bharat self-reliant policy. And so on the 1st of September, the Australian Trade, Tourism and Investment Minister participated in a video conference meeting with India's Minister for Commerce and Industry, Goyal, and their ministerial counterpart in Japan to discuss a new supply chain resilience initiative. And the three ministers reaffirmed their determination to take a lead in delivering a free, fair, inclusive, non-discriminatory, transport, predictable and stable trade and investment environment in our region and in keeping markets open. They also agreed to work with other countries in the region towards the launch of a new regional supply chain initiative later this year, around November 2020, in the hope that will enhance supply chain resilience across our neighbourhood. And we're hoping that further details, including the scope of that initiative, will be developed ahead of a possible launch by leaders in November with the involvement, hopefully, of Australia, Japan, India, and of course any other interested countries.
India and Australia are friendly nations, and you are also High Commissioner here for quite some time. So we are in the pandemic era, and we will be moving in post-pandemic period. So what is your friendly suggestion for India to join effectively in global supply chain? Do you have any suggestions for domestic restructuring and some domestic work to be done in India for joining the global supply chain?
Well, I think India has already, through various ministers, set out the sectors that they're interested in. And if I can be bold in a sense, India is the pharmacy to the world, and of course it came as clearly a shock to pharmaceutical manufacturers here in India to realise at the start of COVID just how strongly they were relying on other countries for the supply of their active pharmaceutical ingredients. So we know that that's an area where India is concentrating on trying to improve its performance in the manufacture of those pharmaceutical ingredients, so that that part of the magnificent pharmaceutical industry, that part of the supply chain of that magnificent pharmaceutical industry will be resilient and strong, whether we have another pandemic like this, God forbid, or whether some other crisis affects the world or our region.
It was very interesting thing to hear when we were in June this year that India and Australia, joined first bilateral summit through virtual means. How interesting was it for you? How challenging it was for you?
Well, it was certainly challenging, and as a former Chief Minister of a state in Australia, I've never seen the behind-the-scenes work that leads up to a summit, let alone a virtual summit. And I have to say that officials in the Ministry of External Affairs and the people here at the High Commission, as well as our colleagues in Australia, worked incredibly hard to ensure the success of India's first virtual leaders summit. And if I'm honest with you, Akhilesh, I warned my Prime Minister ahead of time that because it was virtual, because the technology that's involved in virtual summits means there are some sensitive issues you can't raise, I suggested to my Prime Minister he might find the meeting a bit flat. Well, I was delighted to discover that the interaction between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Morrison was positive, it was upbeat, it was humorous at times, and it was everything you'd expect of a face-to-face meeting, even though they were separated by the great Indian Ocean. The important thing, Akhilesh, is that the summit was based on years of work on both sides of the Indian Ocean, years of work across many sectors, defence, trade, strategic, health collaboration and the like. And that's what culminated in such a success in June. We saw the elevation of a partnership with India rise to a comprehensive strategic partnership. We saw the signing of a range of practical agreements to boost the relationship between Australia and India. And I think it's brought two countries even closer together. But that's not surprising, given that we're both democracies. We have many shared values in common. And at times like this, in the middle of a crisis, you like to hang close to those people who share your values, who share your outlook for the world. And of course, to be honest, we also know that India is finally emerging as a larger player on the world stage, and we want to support India's efforts to reform and make more representative the multilateral institutions that we all rely upon.
Just to understand the format of that summit, was it in a traditional first one-on-one meeting between the two leaders and then delegation level talks and signing the agreements, or it was something different?
Well, it was largely like that, but of course, as I said, there are certain topics you can't raise in audio-visual discussions because we don't have the security to some of those technologies at this stage. But it was a back and forth discussion, as you would expect in a face-to-face meeting. In relation to the signing of agreements, they were done slightly differently in advance of the meeting, only just in advance, so that the various ministers in both countries exchanged signed copies, electronically ahead of the meeting. But all the agreements, I can assure you, are legally signed. All the agreements are currently being implemented by both of our countries because we're determined to try and ensure that we further the relationship. But Akhilesh, I'm amazed and pleased at how quickly technology is being used and has been adapted by even diplomacy to further its forms. And there's no better example of that than the work done by your Prime Minister and your External Affairs Minister, who have been incredibly active throughout the pandemic from day one of the lockdown in reaching out to world leaders, foreign ministers and others to try and ensure that firstly that the health of the neighbourhood was okay, but then secondly to start to focus on that great work of trying to reform our multilateral institutions to make them better and more fit for purpose the next time we strike such troubled waters.
Excellency, in that virtual summit, we upgraded our relationship from a strategic partnership to comprehensive strategic partnership. So what was the significant thing in upgrading this relationship? What news would our audience understand about it?
Over the past months and years, we've seen India and Australia work even more closely together on shared goals, particularly contributing to a more secure, open, inclusive and prosperous Indo-Pacific and making our economies stronger and more resilient. And of course, as I've just said, strengthening multilateral institutions so they can deliver for all of us. Recognising this strengthening relationship, the Prime Minister has jointly announced the elevation of the relationship to the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, which marks our commitment to each other as partners in the Indo-Pacific and ensures a deepening of the strategic alignment, including foreign and defence ministers 2+2 meetings at least every 2 years. We both share a deep commitment to a more secure, open and inclusive, prosperous Indo-Pacific. Indeed, your Prime Minister said it was our sacred obligation to deliver it. Our CSP with India isn't just symbolic, it's underpinned by practical action across a range of areas, including a joint declaration on maritime cooperation, a new arrangement on cyber and critical technology, and agreements around boosting two-way trade and investment and reopening discussions on a free trade agreement.
So we also went into logistical agreements. So does this comprehensive strategic tie include defence and security issues also?
It does, and some of those issues obviously I can't talk about, but the mutual logistics support agreement is one of the centrepieces of practical cooperation under the CSP, because it builds on one of my 4Ds. I often describe our relationship with India built on 4Ds, which are democracy, defence, diaspora and dosti. And of course, defence is the second of those Ds. And the agreement will allow the enhancement of our military interoperability, as well as enabling complex military engagements like AusIndex a year or two ago, and greater combined responsiveness to regional humanitarian disasters when they occur. It paves the way for greater cross-service military activity between our two nations, and it continues a remarkable step-up change in the defence relationship, because even without the issue of Malabar, our joint defence activities have grown fourfold over the past 6 years.
Excellency, Australia is one of the major education hub of the world, and India, Australia have been doing very good in educational cooperation. So how do you see the future of educational cooperation between the two countries, given the fact that due to pandemic, it is very difficult to go to and fro between the countries?
Well, that's the biggest obstacle we currently face, Akhilesh. It's an issue that is causing concern for students here who want to come to Australia, and we're trying to address it. But let me say at the outset, we value the strong and growing people-to-people links between Australia and India, and we understand that the education sector of that, the students who come to Australia to study, then come back here and pursue careers, are an important part of it. And we recognise that the disruption of COVID to all of our lives has been troubling, and the Australian government did announce a number of measures to support international students from across the world, including India, who were stranded in Australia during COVID. For students thinking about study in Australia, we've also introduced new measures, including free masterclasses on the Study in Australia website that they can view and participate in to give them a taste of what Australian education looks like. The government's also introduced flexible visa arrangements to assist current and prospective students. And importantly, it's recommenced granting of student visas lodged outside Australia. And this means that when borders do reopen, students will already have the visa and be able to make arrangements to travel. I should also say that the state government, like India, Australia is a federation. State governments are working on pilot programs to determine how best to bring international students safely to Australia to study next year. And those pilot programs are designed to ensure that we can offer students the opportunity to come to Australia, and they and their parents know that it can be done safely, free of any of these diseases that we're currently battling, and that they'll have access to that first-class education that they seek. In terms of bilateral cooperation, the CSP recognised education, research and skills as central components of our relationship, and that's why we've agreed on an MOU in vocational education and trading, and it's why we have so many research institutions, including at this time those working on COVID, cooperating together, including Griffith University and III in Hyderabad. Can I say, Akhilesh, that I want to congratulate the government of India, though, on its new national education policy, because we know it's the first in 3 decades, but it is as sweeping as it is transformational. And happily, it also encourages the internationalisation of India's education system, which would allow the top 100 universities of the world to set up campuses in Australia. And I'm happy about that because at least 7 of those top 100 are Australian universities. So the focus on the NEP's focus on increasing quality and expanding access, I think, provides future opportunities for India and Australia to collaborate even further in relation to education.
In the document between the two countries that was signed in June summit between two prime ministers, I also saw that there might be some cooperation on administrative reforms. So what do you mean by cooperation in administrative issues between India and Australia?
Well, of course, we share a number of things in common, including the fact that our bureaucracies were delivered to us by the British. And therefore, they're in need of constant reform and constant attention. And to be serious, I think the fact is that given that we share common systems, given that we share common parliamentary systems and other institutions, we believe that there's opportunities for us to learn from each other. Can I say that when I was Chief Minister of New South Wales, I visited a Chief Minister of Gujarat who went on to even greater things, and he showed me his system in that state of how they enabled citizens to get greater access to government services through the internet. And of course, like a good traveller, I took those ideas home to New South Wales and we built our own system. They're the sorts of ideas that you can share. I know that in the lead up to the coming monsoon session of Parliament, after a meeting with the Speaker of the Lok Sabha, I decided to forward to him the rules, regulations and the protocols that Australia was using to hold a session of Parliament in the middle of the COVID pandemic. I think there's lots of useful ways in which we can cooperate around the public sector, around ensuring that what governments announced are delivered in a timely way to benefit the citizens who they serve, to, as I said, try and improve citizens' access to services. But there's much that we can learn, in particular in the technology sector, in the way in which Indian states and the union government enable their citizens to interact with them and the way in which they directly interact with their citizens using technology.
My last two questions, sir. One is that, India, Australia and Indonesia, are we moving sincerely towards forming some trilateral, a different type of trilateral?
Well, I think what we saw from the Indonesian foreign minister a week or two ago was acknowledgement that in a discussion with the Australian foreign minister that she was hopeful of such a trilateral agreement. But Australia, India and Indonesia are already working together promoting a peaceful and prosperous Indo-Pacific, including through ASEAN-led forums and the Indian Ocean Rim Association. So both India and Australia bilaterally, but in some senses together, are already doing that work. But obviously the Indonesian foreign minister has flagged her interest in taking it to a more regular basis. We've discussed between us all opportunities to work together based on our respective priorities on counter-terrorism, the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, development assistance to the region, maritime issues and humanitarian disaster relief that from time to time befalls our region. Our senior officials already meet annually on a bilateral basis, so what the Indonesian Foreign Minister has suggested would simply take it to the next level. And, as two of Australia's closest partners in the region, we see opportunities to grow trilateral cooperation with India and Indonesia, and we would welcome a trilateral.
My last question, and I just want a very brief answer from you, Excellency. There has been development in Middle East, like UAE going close to Israel diplomatically. Saudi Arabia allows Indian flight to go to Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. So how do you see these developments?
Well, we welcome the normalisation of diplomatic relationships between Israel and the UAE, and that Israel has agreed to suspend annexation plans in the West Bank. And it's an important step forward in whichever way you look at it. So my government is a long-standing supporter of the two-state solution for both Israel and Palestine to coexist together. We encourage them to return to the direct peace negotiations. But I have to say that what we've seen in recent days in the Middle East gives us all hope again of the renewal for such a peaceful outcome to this troubled region of the world.
Thank you so much, Excellency. Thank you so much for talking to Rajya Sabha Television.
Thank you.
Thank you.